Alright guys, in this video we are going to take a look at yet another unofficial Raspberry Pi 4 release by the Supreme team. This is the Supreme Pro build, and it's definitely something you guys are going to want to check out. And in this video we're going to do exactly that. This is Steve from Restalgia, and let's get started. Okay, so before we jump into this video, I do want to mention that RetroPie did actually officially release their version of RetroPie 4.6, which does have Raspberry Pi 4 support. Now it is in beta, and I do plan on doing a standalone video, but I do want to mention that I am aware of the official RetroPie release for the Pi 4, and that I am going to take a peek at it. That being said, the build that we're going to talk about today is actually really cool, so we're going to go ahead and jump on into it. Alright guys, so here we are running on our Raspberry Pi 4, and this is the new Supreme Pro Raspberry Pi 4 build with RetroPie and a bunch of other features, and I do gotta say that this is a substantial improvement over the last video I had done, and there's a lot of really cool things that we're gonna kind of cover in this video. So the first thing that we're going to do is take a look at the obvious menu, and everything looks more or less the same as the previous build. Now the big notable difference is that this comes preloaded with a bunch of cores and emulators ready to go, as well as Open Beats of Rage, and then we've got things like Amiga, Dreamcast is ready to go, and we will talk about Dreamcast in a little bit, but Cody's preloaded for us, and we've got a bunch of other things as well as some shareware games. So right out of the box you actually do get games. Now I do want to mention absolutely no ROMs are going to come with this build. You will have to download this, write the image to your SD card, and then you are responsible for loading your own games. The process is very easy, just like with any other RetroPie build that you'd have with the Raspberry Pi 3. You can go ahead and access it right over your network. Just type in the IP address, or you're going to be able to type in the / RetroPie command in your search feature, and that should populate as well. Now aside with the shareware, we do have Pixel, and we will talk about that again a little bit later because this is actually a pretty nice feature, and I do like that it is included right on the home page. And then we've got ports, and we've got a power option as well as a bunch of standalone emulators. Now with those standalone emulators, what you can expect is much better performance than a standard RetroArch core. PSP is a good example. We are running on the PPSS-PP emulator, and it actually runs games quite well. The same thing is actually going to be true about Dreamcast. And if I just jump into Dreamcast for a quick second, you will see at the top it says Start RiCast, and that is going to be pretty standard amongst the Raspberry Pi images. However, we are not actually running on RiCast. We're going to be running on a standalone version of Redream, and this isn't new for the Raspberry Pi. A lot of Pi builds are using Redream, but it is important to note because Redream is a substantially more stable emulator, and you get substantially better performance out of it than you will out of RiCast. Now moving on back to the main menu, as you guys can see, I've loaded up a couple different consoles, N64 for example, and what I'm going to do in terms of showcasing for games is going to be some of the more difficult things to emulate. For example, N64, PSP, and Dreamcast. And then we are going to talk about Pixel because Pixel actually gives us access to emulate things that you wouldn't typically have on a Raspberry Pi 4 through RetroPie. Now before we do that, we are just going to go ahead and shoot over into the options, and I'm going to show you guys what this is all going to come bundled up with. So right out the gate, when you take a look in your options, you've got a lot of control over what you want this to look like and any specific features that you want it to have. For example, we've got things like emulation tools, we've got our standard RetroPie tools, which would be right here, and we've also got our visual tools, but they've included things like the Easy Hacks toolkit, which is nice for loading up background music, which does come pre-installed. Now I tend to keep that off when I'm doing videos, but it is a nice feature to have when you're browsing through your menus and your games to have a little bit of background music, and they do include a bunch of royalty-free music, which is nice as well. You've got a Fix My Build option, and then you've got a few other things like the Supreme Online tool. In terms of the Fix My Build feature, it allows you to essentially correct any configuration problems or any major issues that happen to your build. You can actually go in here and you can get things fixed up. Additionally, the nice thing about these builds by Supreme, with their tool like this Supreme Online tool, you get access to updates and you don't really have to worry about getting new versions and reflashing your SD card and constantly re-putting together your builds. It's not necessary. You can actually pull all the downloads, and they're incredibly quick. So if there's a bug and it's been reported to them, they are super fast on getting things corrected and then sent back out to the masses. So you get a very nice clean build. And honestly, although this is not an official RetroPie build, it feels like it's an official RetroPie build. Now, I do want to mention, if you are looking at high-end gaming, you are going to need to overclock your Raspberry Pi 4, and they've actually got a tool built in for that. You just hop on over to the Raspberry Pi tool section, and then you scroll on down to the overclock optimized feature, which is right over here. And when you click on that, it will take you into your options here, and then you have the option to choose how you want this overclocked. Now, I've already overclocked the CPU to 2 GHz, and my GPU is running at 620 MHz, and that's the maximum that you can overclock it based off of their pre-built clock rates. But it's important to note, you should absolutely never, ever overclock your Raspberry Pi 4, especially this high, without a very high quality heatsink, and at a very minimum, a fan. You do not want to burn out your CPU or your GPU, otherwise you're just going to end up with a broken Raspberry Pi, and nobody wants to deal with that. Now I'm going to show you guys just a little bit of gameplay footage of some of those consoles, specifically N64, PSP, and Sega Dreamcast, so that way you guys can have an idea of how well they are currently running on the Raspberry Pi 4 with an overclock system. And then after that, I'm going to talk about this feature over here called Pixel. It's actually pretty interesting, and I think it's going to be something a lot of people will take advantage of. Now this, again, isn't a brand new feature, but it's something that I haven't talked about previously, and a lot of people aren't as familiar with it if they're just messing around with a Raspberry Pi 4 or 3 for the first time. So what we're going to do is go ahead and jump into some N64 emulation, and I do want to say that N64 emulation is substantially better here than it is on, say, a 3B+. There are still some problems, but even some of the games that are a lot more difficult to emulate, for example, Conker's Bad Fur Day, actually run fairly well. I'm just going to show you guys 15 or 20 seconds of a few different games, so that way you guys can see for yourself. So we're going to go ahead and jump on into it.
Who's this guy?
If you think you're coming this way...
Okay, so as you guys can see, N64 actually ran fairly well. A lot of the games are still not playable. You're going to run into some issues with things like Cruising the World. They just don't emulate very well, so you're not going to have much luck with them. But a lot of the other games are working pretty good, and you got a pretty high compatibility rate right now running on the Raspberry Pi 4 through this build, so that's actually really nice to see. Now the next thing I'm not going to talk too much about is the Dreamcast. As I said, we are using Redream in order to emulate the games, and it runs incredibly well. So what I'm going to do is just quickly show you guys maybe 2 or 3 games, just a few seconds of each game. So we're going to jump on into it, and what you can expect is somewhere between 50 to 60 FPS, and that's including on some of the harder to run games like something like Soul Calibur or Dead or Alive 2. So I'm going to show you guys those games here.
Versus Sophitia. Battle 1, fight!
So Dreamcast performance is actually really good. Now we're going to go ahead and jump over to PSP. And I do want to mention with PSP, we still have a ton of games that are not functioning 100%. Things like God of War are not going to run 100%. Even when you drop the resolution down and you start playing around with some of the graphical settings, you can technically play it, but it's not that great. So I will show that as an example, but I'm also going to show a couple other games that are running really good. So we're going to go ahead and start it up.
Press the L button and R button at the same time to crouch. Press the X button while crouching to do a high jump.
So there you guys have it. PSP does run pretty well. The games that do run well, you can probably bump up resolution to like X3, maybe even X4, depending on the game. Most of those games are going to be standard on X2 resolution, and for God of War, I had that running on X1, which is why it looks so pixelated. But now we're going to talk about Pixel, and the reason that we want to talk about Pixel here is because the developers at Supreme have actually done something that not very many, if any, of the other Raspberry Pi 4 builds are doing, and that essentially allows you to switch between 32-bit and 64-bit systems. So Pixel itself stands for Pi Improved X Windows Environment Lightweight, and it's more or less a desktop mode powered by Raspbian. So when we go into that, we can actually go ahead and switch over to 64-bit mode. And the reason why that's beneficial is because there are a lot of programs that actually can only run on a 64-bit system. And the main one that I'm talking about here is Dolphin. So if you want to get some GameCube games or Nintendo Wii games going, you're going to need to switch the build into 64-bit mode in order to get it to run. Now I'm going to go ahead and get this up and running so you guys can see what I mean. Okay, and here we are up and running, and as you guys can probably tell by the moving cursor on screen, I do have a mouse connected as well as a wireless keyboard, and those things are going to become very handy in order to navigate through on a desktop environment like this. Now, what they've gone ahead and done is they've made configuring your system very simple. If you want to switch to a 64-bit system, they've actually got a config script right on the desktop. All you need to do is double click on it and execute it in Terminal. Terminal is going to pop up and it's going to say, hey, depending on what you're going to want to do. And if you guys look over here, it says enable 64-bit. And when that is, Dolphin and Kodi will work. Now, before you get too excited, yes, you can run GameCube and Wii games on the Raspberry Pi 4, but it is a far cry from perfect. And there are very few games that are actually running even close to full speed. As the developers spend time optimizing Dolphin specifically for the hardware on the Raspberry Pi 4, I think we're going to get a lot more compatibility, but right now there are very few games that are actually worthwhile playing. And I am going to show you guys that, but I did want to mention that and give you guys full disclosure in advance. But switching over to 64-bit is quite simple. We're going to go ahead and click OK, and then it just asks us what we want to do. We are going to enable 64-bit support for programs like Dolphin and Kodi, but it's also important that once that's done, it's going to reboot our system, and then we want to go back in here and we also want to enable the ignoring of EDID/display data. And the reason for that is it just makes the software run a little bit cleaner, so it is important to do that as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and do both of those, and because it requires reboots, I'm just going to go ahead and fast forward. Okay guys, so we are back now. Now before we go ahead and go through that Dolphin emulation, I do want to mention that because this is essentially like a desktop computer, you can do a ton of things. So if you go over to the top to the quote-unquote start menu, the applications menu it's called, You've got a ton of accessories, you've got a ton of features. There's some games and emulators already pre-built in, and then even things like accessing the internet. You've got Firefox pre-built in and Chromium as well. And I mean, the Raspberry Pi 4 is actually quite good for a lot of streaming or any of those sort of things. So if you want to go ahead and hop onto YouTube and use this and watch some videos, you can absolutely do that. Or if you want to go onto Netflix, it is possible to do that, and it should be able to output in 1080p. So now, in terms of Dolphin emulation, it's not quite as simple as just a double click on an application or go over here into the game section. You actually have to pull it up via terminal, and there is a README right on the desktop, and it gives you all the instructions very easily step by step. So when we double click on that, it'll pull it over, and it'll say, hey, do you want to start Minecraft? This is how you do it. Do you want to start Counter-Strike? This is how you do it. To start Dolphin emulator, this is how you do it. And with Dolphin, it's actually interesting because they give you both the Dolphin emulator, and they also give you the Ishii Iruka fork of Dolphin, which happens to have slightly better compatibility. And the big difference between the two is that Ishii Iruka tends to actually have reduced CPU usage on some of the graphic threads, which does improve performance just a little bit. Now keep in mind, there isn't a massive difference between one or the other, but there is slight differences, and you may actually find that some games run better on the Dolphin version and others are going to run on the Ishii Iruka version better. But regardless, it still gives us all of our information. As you can see over here, it says open up terminal and type this command in here. Terminal's right on the desktop as well. You just double click on the LX terminal. Then we're going to go ahead and grab our command. So it's the SCH root and all the way to the end of Pi 64. We're going to copy that. And then we're just going to go ahead and paste it right on into the command line. We're going to hit enter, and it's going to ask us for a password. The password is always going to be Supreme. It's listed right over here. So once we type that on our keyboard, Supreme, and hit enter, and now we just have to enter in the additional commands, which would be sudo chmod, and then it's got the directory right over here. We're going to go ahead and copy that and paste it. And once that's in there, we're going to hit enter. And then all that's left for us to do is decide, do we want to run Dolphin-emu, or do we want to run the Ishii Iruka version of Dolphin? Now I'm going to go ahead and run this version right over here, the Ishii Iruka, just because the games I tested tended to perform a little bit better in this version. So we're going to go ahead and paste that, and I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to automatically launch. Now we are going to get some errors on screen specifically about language support and things like that, and that's totally fine. We can go ahead and bypass those. The first thing that we're going to want to do when we get Dolphin up and running is that we do need to configure our controllers. If we hop over to the controller section, you can see that in port number 1, we've got a standard controller. We're going to hit configure, and we want to select our Xbox One controller, which is what I've got connected. And if you have a PS4 controller or PS3 or Xbox 360, that's what you're going to select. But you do want to make sure that the buttons are mapped correctly. So as you guys can see here, I've got my A and my B buttons, and they are mapped in correctly. But the important thing was that I had to remap my start button, I had to remap my Z buttons, and I had to remap my L and R triggers. And I think I even had to remap the D-pad. So it's not always 100%. Just make sure that your configuration is done. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to do much in game. So we'll go ahead and close out of that, and you'll want to do the same thing for the Wii remote. Again, you go into the configure mode, you'll select your controller, you'll remap all your keys, and for the Wii I had to remap everything. So just keep that in mind. The extension support is not functioning. At least it wasn't functioning when I was trying it. I kept getting errors and then the software would crash. And I don't know if that's different on the Dolphin emulator side of things, but it certainly is with this version of Dolphin. So we're going to go ahead and close out of all of these, and all that's left for us to do is to pick a game. Now, when we open up a game here, I've actually got my directory preloaded right over here where it says Gamecube. But what I had done was I loaded up all my games into my Raspberry Pi ROMs folder, just connecting over the network. So if you go into the RetroPie folder and then the ROMs folder, you're going to see all the ROM folders that you would have had if you were loading up games into RetroPie. I just created a new folder called Gamecube, and inside of that folder I have some of my Gamecube games, and I also threw in a couple Wii games in here just for the sake of making it a little bit easier on me. Now I did test a few of these games. I wanted to show off Soul Calibur. I could not get it running, and I know that it is possible. Maybe it might be an issue with my game file, but I will show you guys a couple games, and keep in mind that there are still a lot of bugs and a lot of things that need to be worked out. So let's go ahead and jump into a couple of games here. Okay, so as you guys saw, GameCube is not something that you guys should really bank on playing on this thing, especially at this time. Maybe in the future it's something you guys can look at, but certainly not right now. Now, in terms of getting this thing up and running, I'm going to leave all the links in the description down below as always, so hop on down there and go ahead and download this for yourself. Make sure if you guys get a chance, give a shout out to the Supreme team that created this. Again, this is the Supreme Pro version, and it's pretty much as good as it's going to get when it comes to the Raspberry Pi 4 base images. Now, keep in mind, it is a large download. I think the base file's 15 gigs, so you're going to want a fairly large micro SD card to get it loaded up, but that's something that you guys are going to have to figure out on your own. But that's all I've got for you guys. Let me know in the comment section below what you guys think of this build. Is it something that you're going to play around with, or are you guys currently using a different build that you want me to check out? Let me know down below. Thank you so very much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys again real soon.